Good morning and welcome to Gospel Life Church. We're so glad you've joined us today. We hope today will both inspire and challenge you to be the person God created you to be. Before our service begins, we want to tell you about a few important things to help you discover more about who GLC is, where we're headed, and how you can join the adventure. First, if you have kids, we have fun, video-driven lessons designed with them in mind. You can access these lessons by clicking on the link in the description from whichever social media platform you are watching from this morning. And if you're watching from our website, you can just click on the GLC Kids tab in the top right corner. Our Gospel Life Kids team does a great job each week preparing 2 different worship experiences, one for toddlers and preschool and one for elementary-aged kids. Each lesson is about 15 minutes and will keep them engaged while also showing them the gospel and how it can be worked out in their lives. Also, take time to check out our resources page for fun ways to talk with your kids about what they learned this week and for other ways your family can grow in faith. Second, whether you have been a part of Gospel Life since the beginning or this is your very first time, we would ask that you please fill out a digital connection card. You can find this card by clicking the Connect tab on our website or by clicking the Connect link in the description of the social media platform from which you are watching. These cards help us know that you joined us this morning and are a way for you to communicate with us about the questions you might have, prayer requests on your heart, and ways you'd like to connect. If you are a guest with us and you fill out a card, we will make a $5 donation to help local families during the stay-at-home orders. Also, we'll send you a $5 gift card as a free gift for connecting with us today. Finally, if you click the Help button or the link in the description, it will take you to a page where you can ask for help or find ways where you can contribute to help local families during the COVID shutdown. Again, we're so glad that you have joined us this morning. We hope you enjoy the service.
Today's reading is Mark chapter 13, verses 1 through 13. And as he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And as he sat on the Mount of Olives, opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished?" And Jesus began to say to them, "See that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines, but these are the beginning of the birth pains. But be on your guard, for they will deliver you over to councils, and you will be beaten in synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them. And the gospel must first be proclaimed to all nations, and they will bring you to trial and deliver you over. Do not be anxious beforehand what you are to say, but say whatever is given to you in that hour, for it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. And brother will deliver brother over to death, and the father his child, and the children will rise against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved." This is the word of the Lord.
Gospel Life Church. I'm Chase, one of the pastors here. So glad you're joining us wherever and whenever you're watching this. Thanks so much for being a part of this morning as we continue to look at Jesus' life from the biography of Mark. Last week we were, Bryant was speaking to us regarding Jesus' authority from chapter 12, and the goal was today to complete that. But unfortunately, he got really sick, and so I'm kind of pinch hitting for him this morning, so you have to excuse us for that. Next week, he'll continue that, Lord willing. But today, we're going to fast forward, though, to chapter 13. and we'll go through that. And really, this is the first part of a three-part series where we're going to look at really Jesus' talk about the end times to his disciples, really throughout chapter 13. And we'll continue this one as we conclude the other parts here. Probably late June, early July is when we'll begin those things. But this will really be hopefully an encouragement to you this morning, and also hopefully insightful as well. And as we are here in chapter 13, just kind of a quick recap. In chapter 11 begins Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem, and this is really a week-long period, really between his entrance to his death on a cross and subsequent resurrection that we'll see here from Mark. And on Monday, he enters Jerusalem on a donkey. He's proclaimed as Messiah. Everything's lining up for Jesus to do what they expected the Messiah to do, which is to take down that evil Roman Empire, right? But instead, Jesus responds with the next day, he curses the fig tree, as we preached just a few weeks ago. And then also he then goes into the temple and cleanses the temple, chasing out the religious leaders and the merchants who were taking advantage of the poor and the outsider, and has some things to say there. And at that point really pronounces judgment on the temple on Tuesday. Here we are on Wednesday now of Passion Week, just mere days before Jesus dies on the cross. And what Bryant was preaching about last week was these kind of the end of his public ministry. He does some teaching and some communicating with religious leaders and others. And then now here where we're at, where we've already read this morning in chapter 13, we find ourselves really at the end of that public ministry, where from now on, most of his discussions will take place between he and mostly just the 12 disciples that he has, one of which, by the way, will betray him, Judas. But also there were a few others, probably about 40 or so that were kind of around, a lot of women and some of their sons and some other disciples who were following. John Mark, the author of Mark's biography, is one of those. And so he would have been privy to some of this information, but not very much. As we'll see here, this conversation that specifically takes place is really between Jesus and four others, Andrew, James, John, and Peter. And these are two sets of brothers that Jesus has a conversation with, kind of a private conversation regarding the destruction of the temple and the end of all things. And they're going to ask him some very important questions. But before we continue, let me just pray. God, we are so grateful for your grace and mercy. We thank you for your word that often communicates to us right where we are. And we think about just the chaos that has ensued in these past number of months now here in 2020, and how it just feels like all is lost. God, I pray that this morning would be encouraging to us. It would anchor us to the truth, but it would also, furthermore, it would take us to a space where we find hope founded solely in you, and the hope that we have, not just for this life, but also life in the next, solely connected to the person and work of Jesus Christ. God, we're so grateful for your son, Jesus, who is our hope. It's in his name we pray. Amen. All right, so as we kind of dive in here, I'm going to read just part of what we've already read this morning, and I'll start in verse 2. As they are headed out of the temple, out of the city, they notice the temple. This temple is built on a hill there in Jerusalem, and on the temple, the way it was built by Herod, just to display how wealthy and how awesome he was, he had gold encased in the brick. And so it's considered to be the eighth wonder of the world, but obviously it was destroyed in 70 AD. But as in the mornings when the sun would rise over the mountains and rise, and it would kind of hone in on Jerusalem, often you couldn't even look at it because it would gleam and glow so much and shine so much you couldn't even look at the temple. But at night it would glimmer, and that's what they're noticing here. And so one of the disciples just makes a comment, look how beautiful the stones are, specific to that gold, right, that we mentioned. And so Jesus then, trying to teach his disciples some very significant things, has some things even for us this morning as well. Listen to what he says, verse 2, and Jesus said to them, do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. Look at verse 3, and as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? And so they have a couple of questions that Jesus will specifically answer here for us. And the first of which today he's going to answer the first question, which is what are the sign of these things? And so he'll answer that for us this morning. But a couple things I want you to draw attention to as in verse 2, Jesus makes another prediction. He's already predicted, hey, the temple's going to be destroyed. Now you have to understand we talked about this at length a few weeks ago. So if you want to go back and watch the May 24th sermon regarding the fig tree and the temple, feel free to do that because it will give you further ideas of what really was taking place and the symbolicness connected to the fig tree. But with that, one of the things that bears repeating is this. Jesus is talking about something not that has taken place. He's talking about something that will take place. He's predicting something that's coming in the future. Now, this is evidence of his deity. This is evidence that he is in fact God in the flesh, that he knows things that no human would know. Why? Because he's God. He knows these things. And one of the things that also is important for us to understand, this gospel, this biography that was written, most, if not all, scholars would say it was written roughly about 1 to 2 decades after Jesus died on the cross. Okay, which would then put it about 2 decades prior to the destruction of the temple. This is prophecy we're seeing has been fulfilled. That if Jesus is who it's saying here, and it's showing us here very clearly that Jesus is in fact God, which also then gives us hope because what he's about to talk about, he's going to give some hope through it as well, which obviously then we can take heart in the midst of some very difficult sayings here. So as we saw here, the 2 questions are asked, and he's going to answer the first one for us this morning, and then in a couple of weeks we'll answer the next one. But the question in verse 4, tell us when these things will be, and what will be the sign when all these things are to be accomplished. And that first question of when are these things going to happen? Like, when is this going to start? What's going to take place? And so Jesus has some statements to them. And we can look at verse 5 here, and it says this, see that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and they will lead many astray. And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This is to take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. These are but the beginning of the birth pains. And so he says, listen, be ready. Right? Jesus says to them, be ready. Be on the lookout. For what? So there's a couple things that are going to lead to the end of all things. And that's number one, you're going to have some deceptions that are going to take place. And, in his day and age, he was saying, listen, there's going to be opposition that will rise. Now, listen, he's talking to a group that basically consists of 40 people, a very small group of people. Why would Jesus be concerned about the small little bitty group of people having a world that seems to be against it? Or at least to put it this way, there's a ton of opposition, both humanly speaking, because there was, and we'll talk about that here in a moment, but also then the spiritual opposition that's going to take place as well. I mean, you're talking about 40 people. Well, because we're going to see, we'll even talk about it a little bit today, the church explodes, right? And here we are today in 2020, a little over 2,000 years later, or almost 2,000 years later, we're having a conversation about the things that took place a little over 2,000 years ago. Why is that important? Because there has continually been this opposition against the church, and specifically the gospel that is taking place, which can then maybe distract and turn the church away from its main goal, which Jesus will give them before he ascends to heaven, which is to preach the gospel here, there, and everywhere, and to make disciples. That's their goal, and that's what they were. But often this opposition comes in. It comes from without the church, but it also comes from within. And today we have some of this as well that we've seen. Since I've even been a pastor, there's been some things arise that have been very detrimental to the church on some level, and they have, again, turned the church away from its original mission centered upon the gospel. And so there's a couple things today that I want to kind of point out when it comes to this idea. First of all, deceptions, this first idea that he mentions here. We have a couple things that are kind of without the church, although it does reside in the church as well. And this idea of pluralism and universalism. Universalism essentially says this, that all people are innately good. And so all people, for the most part, depending on where you land in this universalism thing, all people end up going to heaven or afterlife, or however you want to put that. They might say perhaps if there is a hell, there are some that won't get there. Guys like Hitler, right? They're not going to get there, right? But most people, in fact, all people, except for those few scum of the earth types, right? They're going to go to heaven. And you have this idea of pluralism, and I'm definitely reducing this. I would encourage you to continue to search these things out. We're going to talk about specifically, and we have this thing on Wednesdays called our question and answer. It's a Q&A time. I'd encourage you to watch those and also ask good questions because we talk about some of these things. They're only about 5 minutes, but then we also give some resources towards these things. And we'll talk about things like why these things matter and how you work these things out over the coming weeks. But this idea of pluralism is this, that there are these systems, these different systems of religion, right? You've got Christianity, you've got Judaism, you have Islam, you have Buddhism, Hinduism, just spirituality as a whole. You have, and then even maybe inside of those, even these little subsets, right, of different types of beliefs, right? And then you have maybe even atheism. You have these, and you kind of draw a circle around each one. If you imagine, I were to do that this morning, and then at the top you have, whatever it is, afterlife, heaven, spirituality, God, or maybe just moral thinking. Whatever it is, you have all this, and each of these have their way to get there because essentially they're all the same. Right? They're all pursuing the same thing. They're all kind of going at it about the same way, right? That if you're a good person, you do these certain number of things, you're going to get to whatever you're trying to achieve. And so basically they all head towards the same idea. And so we all need to stop arguing amongst each other and just kind of get on board and say, hey, you believe what you believe, I'll believe what I believe, and we're both good, and not try to convince the other of the opposite or speak maybe even harmful language against it. And so, but here's the thing, the gospel, well, it doesn't preach that. The gospel says this, that there's not a number of ways, right? That it's not about how good you are connected to the list of rules that you are supposed to achieve. In fact, it has nothing to do with what you have done or haven't done, but instead is connected to what? The person and work of Jesus Christ. That we put all our hopes into Him, not into what I have or haven't done, right? But instead into Him, and that's the only way. And the gospel is the only path to that abundant life provided through us in Jesus. And the gospel is the only path to heaven and afterlife and a change of heart. And so, again, if you have questions about these things, you want to talk further and continue that dialogue, as this has been a very short conversation on that specific, what I would call a deception and inaccuracy, and something that leads you away from the real truth, which is that God came in the flesh and He died our death on the cross so that we could have both life now and life in the next, and that because of His resurrection, we have access to all of that. If you'd like to discuss that more and talk about that further, man, let me know. We'd love to reach out on your connection card, and we or one of our church leaders would love to have just a discussion with you and just kind of wade through those questions with you on that. Another idea is this idea of moralistic therapeutic deism. This is something that came out of a study that was done by University of North Carolina, this guy named Christian Smith. And so in the midst of their studies, they kind of released some statements. They had taken some adolescents who were kind of headed towards the next stage of their life. And most of these people either had been a part of the church or were a part of the church. And they basically just said, hey, what is the church teaching, essentially? And so they came up with this idea, this moralistic therapeutic deism is really where a lot of the American church is at right now. And here's kind of what that means. Number one, God exists. A God exists who created and ordered the world and watches over human life and earth, right? Number two, God wants people to be good, nice, and fair to each other as it's taught in the Bible and by most world religions. The central goal in life, number three, the central goal in life is to be happy and to feel good about oneself. Number four, God does not need to be particularly involved in one's life except when it is absolutely necessary. And number five, good people go to heaven when they die. So essentially, you have this list of rules, and this flies again right in the face of the gospel. This flies in the face of exactly the opposite of what we're after. This isn't about having people behave in a certain way, and therefore they earn, just by being good, they get something in return. We don't have a God being set back, not involved in what's going on in the world. Instead, we have a Jesus who stepped down into our situation, right? And he lived and He died and He rose again in the midst of our situation. We don't have a God who's set back and only reacts if it's absolutely necessary. That's called deism. That's why you have deism in there. God isn't just concerned about us feeling good about ourselves, right? That's not what the gospel's about. Instead, the gospel is further connected deeply to the person and work of Jesus, where we confront the worst and the best of ourselves and realize we never will measure up. But that's not the end of the story. Because through Christ, We become a new person. Through Christ and through our connectedness to the person and work of Jesus, through that, as we put our faith and hope in Jesus, we start to become a new person day by day by day. The person we were created by God in Jesus to become. And that will eventually come to full culmination after death. And in the midst of that, also, as we live that out, we speak things to our loved ones and our enemies even about the truth of the gospel. And so, but moralistic therapeutic deism is all about centered upon me. Moralistic therapeutic deism, and this is coming, guys, from the church, as well as the next one is as well. And this is probably something we see it here in America, but we're also pumping this out into some of the most destitute places on the earth, trying to convince them of something that if they were connected to this specific type of gospel, the prosperity gospel, that somehow they'll then get the American gospel dream, right? And so they just need to be connected to it. And what's happening is you have, similar to those Pharisees and those religious leaders taking advantage of the poor and the destitute and the outsider, and gaining wealth because of it. The same exact thing is taking place in our world today, and it is deceiving people day by day by day. And instead of offering them hope, it offers them nothing, the complete opposite. And they're finding less and less hope in Jesus. And unfortunately, this is being connected to places like Gospel Life Church, who they see these two things. It's hard to separate the two because they're so inundated by this prosperity gospel dream that some people have, where essentially you reduce Jesus to some kind of a genie. That if you punch, you just rub, you rub the bottle and you ask the wishes in the right format, somehow he'll grant you what you want, as long as you, again, believe in him, right? In a sense, if you have enough faith and you do the right things, you'll earn God's favor and he'll allow you to have access to the American gospel dream, which is life, health, wealth, and success. Let me just encourage you. This again is, unfortunately, it's putrid. And unfortunately, it's coming out of the church. But let me encourage you, on Netflix right now, American Gospel. Go watch that documentary to further kind of dig into this and to see the deception that can sometimes be in our hearts and how we view God in the gospel, but also what's going on in the world. And it can hopefully help us to pray, and then also instruct our families and even our loved ones as well away from this thing, to not be deceived. Not only do we have deception, we also have distraction. And distraction from the main goal, right? That Jesus is coming back, and these things aren't the end. We can have hope, we can take courage, we can have heart. Why? Because this is only a part of the plan. It's not the whole plan. It's not the end of all things, but it's going to come. And so it pushes us there. But sometimes the things that are happening to produce the end of all things, right? Sometimes those things we can feel like it is really the end. And Jesus compares it to childbirth. When Rachel, we were pregnant with our first Caleb, he was due, I think it was like March, he was born March 22nd, but I think it was due like March 18th or something like that, right? And so we're at a wedding. And in fact, Nathaniel and Emily Hofer, who are a part of our church here in Wichita, Gospel Life, they were getting married. This would have been 2011. I think they got married on the 13th of March or something close to that. So I apologize if I got that wrong, guys. But they were at their wedding, and Rachel starts having some labor pains, or what felt like contractions, right? They weren't quite that severe, so we made it through. We went home. We went on some walks. We ate some spicy Mexican food. We did all the things that when you read about that can induce labor. And I always imagined it would be like on the movies, right? Her water breaks. She has contractions. We rush to the hospital, bags packed, ready to go. Boom, we got a baby, and then we're calling people and telling them, and it's this whole cool thing. And that's not what happened for us, and that's not what happens for most people, right? But Rachel, then her water hasn't broken, but so we get to the hospital, they put her on some machines, and we wait around for a couple hours, and come to find out she wasn't really pregnant. She was having what they call Braxton Hicks, which is basically false labor. And it was like, if you've ever seen Arrested Development or Charlie Brown in general, because they're mocking Charlie Brown, that moment where the doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo, that was us walking out of the hospital. We're just like, oh, we thought it was time, and we're so just, in despair. And he was born a few weeks later, the whole thing. But, sometimes we confuse we get it twisted and we think it's the end, but it's not quite ready yet. And that's what Jesus is saying here. He's saying, listen, we can get connected to this. And there's a couple different things I want to talk about here in regards to this idea of distraction. It distracts us away from the reality and the hope that we have in Jesus. And the first thought is this, in the distractions, the error of an American view of the gospel story. We almost sometimes think, and this is true all throughout history, and I'm going to give you a couple examples here in just a moment, but all throughout history, there have been eras of different people who thought they were the central character, right? And it was only through them the gospel will go forth, and we're talking about the church specifically, but just they're the central character, they're the empire, it's never going to end. And time again, we've seen empires rise and fall, and time again, we've seen the church in the midst of all of that. It seems like it's over, but it continues to persist, right? And I think in America, sometimes we get it twisted. And we think that when the end comes, it's going to be the end of America, and then boom, we're going to be ushered into the end of all things, because America is where all is happening, as though the gospel story hinges only upon the success or failure of America, right? And so we view the American church this way, and so then we judge what all else is going on in the world based upon what we see in America. And unfortunately, the disciples do this too, right? So they have this conversation with Jesus here. Fast forward, Jesus dies on the cross. He raises again. He teaches them for 40 days. And as he's about to ascend up to heaven, he has some instructions for them. But in the midst of that, they go, is now the time, Jesus? Because they expect, like, when Jesus leaves, like, boom, it's going to just happen. And all of a sudden, everything's going to fall into place, and the destruction of the temple is going to happen. And boom, they're going to be ushered into the next stage, right? That's what they're expecting, because they just didn't quite understand. He's like, no, listen, it's not just about you as Jewish people. It's bigger than that. You're going to be my witnesses where? Here, there, and everywhere. And there, time and time again, we see this take place. And a couple different examples of this is, I've already given you one. There's also Elijah. Elijah is a prophet in the Old Testament. And he's a guy who conveys the message of God to the people. He speaks for God there. Speaks the message of God, and he has this great victory. Then he's pretty much a death warrant's issued out for him, so he runs and is afraid. It's a weird thing that he does, probably depressed. He goes up onto this mountain and he's sulking, and God confronts him on the mountain, has a conversation with him, and Elijah is just saying, I'm the only one, God. And God says, no, Elijah, you don't understand. There are thousands of men and women who have not kissed the feet of Baal. You are not alone in this. But he felt like he was. He felt like everything hinged upon him. And that's not accurate. In early church history, about near the sack of Rome, right? You have two different guys who are talked about. This guy named Dr. Stephen Nichols has he talks about this on his podcast, 5 Minutes in Church History, and he talks about these two different guys and how they contrast one another. There's this guy named Jerome, who was in Rome at the time of the sacking of Rome, or near it. And he's really integral to church history. And you have this guy named Augustine. And they both are around during the sacking of Rome and really the subsequent destruction. They're around for parts of that. And when this takes place, Jerome, who's just been an incredible church father up to this point, he runs into and says, the world's over. And he goes into a cave, and he expects he's just going to die in this cave. That's his response to this. And then you have Augustine, who when he hears about the sacking of Rome, and then he hears about that there are Vandals coming his way, he sits down and he writes this incredible book called The City of God, where he kind of juxtaposes these two different cities that we have viewed, the city of the earth and of man and the city of God, and how somehow the connection to those two and the tension of them, right? That we ought to be good citizens, we ought to be doing good things and we have rules that we need to abide by, and all these systems that are in place for our good and we need to be good citizens there, but only because we want to point people to the real city. Right? The city of God, the kingdom. And what Augustine does, even in the moments of near his death, he's orchestrating, helping people in the midst of his city in North Africa being sacked as well by those Vandals, and he's helping people even into his death. What kind of response are we going to have, right? Right? Are we going to be distracted from that original mission to go to all nations, preach the gospel here, there, and everywhere, making disciples, right? Are we going to do that, or are we going to be distracted from that because of all that's going on in the world, thinking that everything hinges upon us, and since it's failed, it's over, right? Another idea would be this: if we as Gospel Life Church, we believed that the success of the gospel in our city depended solely on us, right? Listen, that would be crazy. That's a crazy thought. I think sometimes churches think that, right? And us as a little church plant we want our city to be connected to the gospel. We want to see people not just know about Jesus, we want to see them know who the real Jesus is and to joyfully live out the gospel and show others to do the same. We want them to do that. But we have to understand there are an abundance of churches. There aren't enough, but there's an abundance. There's a great amount of churches who are preaching the gospel well in our city. And even some new church plants here in the city who are doing great things. And we are just one puzzle piece to seeing this thing happen, right? It doesn't all fall on our shoulders. It falls on the shoulders of Christ, and he's doing a work even by which we can't see, right? And I think that's important for us to see. Also, on top of it, you got crazy chaos happening in the world, right? You've got things like, even in 2020, you got Corona, you have the race riots and all these things going on. And then you also have murder hornets, right? And each of these things, it's easy to look at each of these issues that have arisen here in 2020 and we get depressed. We want to go into our cave and we want to just declare the world's over and then scroll on Facebook, right? And post the memes that are connected to that. But our hope isn't in. Our hope isn't in what happens here on this earth. It is instead in the one who created this earth and who is involved in all that happens here on this earth. He is the only full answer to each of these issues. If you want to no longer fear, like we have had to do during the midst of COVID, understand that in Jesus there will be a day when disease will no longer be an issue. You want genuine peace? You want where we will be authentically loving one another regardless of our skin color, political connections, gender, socioeconomic status? Is that what you want? Because I do. There will be a day when that will take place. What about no longer worrying about things like murder hornets and natural disasters that are taking place, right? Crazy things attacking us. Well, there will be a day when earth will finally be at rest. And all of this will be over. And that is only in and through Jesus. He's the one who orchestrates it all for the sole purpose of finally all of it being made right. Furthermore, what I find so interesting is how quickly we move on, right? We move on so quickly from these things. If you go to your news feed right now, what you'll find is you won't find very many of things talked about Corona and murder hornets anymore. Well, we've moved on, right, to what's happening now. And it's just so fast and so quickly moving because we think that terrible things are going to continue to persist. And that's what Jesus is saying. Listen, don't get distracted. Stay the course. Stay on mission. Don't move away from it, even in the midst of these crazy things. Why? Because those crazy things are only going to further produce incredible moments for the gospel to be preached. And not that God doesn't grieve over, because he does, over the disasters that are taking place even now, today. But at the same time, God works in the midst of those things, and he uses us, his people, to do that. Will we hide in our cave as these things happen, or will we seek to bring a little taste of the world to come in the midst of these tragedies so that our friends, our family, our neighbors, our enemies can taste heaven themselves with us one day? Is that what we're going to do? How will we respond? And then lastly, he talks about disasters, right? He talks about earthquakes, and I'll throw in there hurricanes and tsunamis and tornadoes. And we also talk about famines. And we can go, the list can go on and on and on about all the different earthquakes that take place. They estimate, the NEIC, National Earthquake Information Center, they estimate we have 20,000 earthquakes each and every year around the world. That's 50 per day. But they also estimate there are 100 million earthquakes that happen every year as well that they can't measure, right? This is just going to continue to get worse, and it's going to continue to be difficult. They're going to continue to persist. You think about the tsunamis and the hurricanes that have taken place. You think about Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Katrina. You think about the tsunamis in Indonesia and the tsunami in Japan, right? Two of the worst tsunamis to ever have happened in the world happened in the last 16 years, right? And on top of that, then you also have things like tornadoes like Greensburg, Mobile, Alabama, Moore, Oklahoma, just to name a few that have happened in the last 15 years. And every single time the gospel persists, and every single time we can't stay on mission, and every single time God is doing something and it's devastating, right? But these are not the end. They're a sign of what's coming. They're those birth pains that are taking place, or the contractions that are taking place, but they're still far apart. And we have to understand that God's at work, right? We also think about famines, and this is what gets me at my heart level. We start talking about people who don't have access to good, clean water, in food on a regular basis. You have 821 million people who struggle each and every day with things like hunger on a daily basis. The Oxfam International estimates that we are on the brink of some very severe, probably the worst ever, famines to ever take place in places like Nigeria, South Sudan, Somalia, and Yemen. And you know what? Here's the thing. These things are real. And you might remember we've kind of stemmed the tide a little bit with what was going on in Sudan, but it's still a real issue, right? These things are happening around the world. And as Christians, we ought to take part in that. And there are things that even we at Gospel Life, we're starting to try to do to help stem the tide in some of these areas. You know, unfortunately, we can't solve it all. We can't be a part of the solution for everything, but we can do these things for some. And that's what we attempt to do in our local and international partnerships. We hope to help stem the tide some and send out others who can do the work that we can't do on site as we do the work here in Wichita. And that's the goal. That's what we're able to do. And we ought to do that and be a part of that. And we ought to pray that God would use us as part of that little small puzzle piece to see these things take place. And while it won't be solved fully here now, we can be a part of helping others to get just that little taste, right? That's what we want to get them to understand, so that they can understand that they can have access to the real city. That's what we want. He goes on to fully encourage them. He says, be encouraged. And he tells them to be ready, but not only that, he says, now I want you to guard your hearts. Verse 9, but be on your guard. While all this is going on, they will deliver you to councils, and you'll be beaten in synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings for my sake to bear witness before them. And one of the things you have to understand, this is probably specific to these four and then the other disciples. All right, this is pretty specific to them. And he tells them to guard their hearts. And this doesn't mean that won't happen for us, but the persecution is going to look a little different for us in each and every one of our situations, but it still persists nonetheless, and it's still a problem, and it still is also something God is using. And we'll talk about that here in a moment, where we find finally our encouragement through all of these hard things. But persecution will happen, right? In 64 AD, Emperor Nero, he ensues this incredibly harsh amount of persecution on the church, mostly because there was this big fire and he wanted to blame it on somebody, so he blames it on the Christians, right? And so really 11 of the 12 disciples, be minus Judas, add in Matthias, plus you have Paul in there too, which that wouldn't be part of the 12, he'd be the 13th, and many others, they die in the midst of his persecution that ensues from 64 AD, where they would literally we'd have these big kind of festivals or parties in his backyard of the palace, and they would line the pathways with these large like torches that were really Christians dipped in wax, and they would light them on fire and they would light the way. That's the kind of brutality that was taking place. And in the midst of this is what happens. The gospel continues to flourish. It's an incredible thing. It's heart-wrenching and scary, but it's also incredible. But then furthermore, you go to 81 AD, Domitian, one of the next emperors, he then ensues another series of this. And you see this time and time and time again, where they have these seasons of persecution in their different eras. And this is where John, the only real remaining disciple at this point, he is actually boiled alive in oil. He survives, so they exile him. And there are many others who died as well during this time. And in the midst of all this is the Bible's being written. In the midst of this, you have the church is flourishing, right? Because here's what Jesus says. He gives them a little sense of hope. He says, but listen, the gospel will be proclaimed to all nations. Most of them say must, but it's a will. It's going to happen. And that's exactly what takes place. All is not lost. The gospel, in the midst of all of this, the crazy and the persecution, in the midst of all of it, the gospel will persevere. By roughly 300 AD. This would be before Constantine comes in and he announces that Christianity is the national religion. Before all of that, by 300 AD, the gospel has spread to almost every part of the known world in the midst of all of this. Now, obviously, that doesn't include the Western Hemisphere, right? North America, South America. It doesn't include China and some of Russia, but it does include the mapped world that they had access to for the most part. The Roman, right, Empire specifically, which was the known world pretty much, right? They had all heard the gospel. Is that insane? It doesn't mean every person was a believer. It just means that they had access to a gospel, a ministry of some sort, some kind of a church in their own city. It's insane to think about that. By the way, that's another proof. Perhaps there's something about this whole Bible thing, right? That this ragtag of 12 plus maybe another, 30 or so other people, somehow that becomes what we see just merely 300 years later. How does that happen, right? How in the world does that happen? Unless God's in the midst of that. Even in the midst of all of this other stuff going on at the same time, in the midst of all these severe amounts of persecution, it's insane. Lastly, look at verses 11 through 13. Starting in 11, he says, and when they bring you to trial and deliver you over, do not be anxious beforehand what you are to say, but whatever is given you in that hour, for it is not you who will speak, but the Holy Spirit. And the brother will deliver brother over to death, and the father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death, and you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. One of the things I want us to see is that God's orchestrating these things. It means he's in charge of all of this, and he's even allowing all of this to take place. Why? Because he has a plan. And he even says, you're going to be delivered to these people. You're going to stand in front of emperors and governors and on down the line, and you're going to speak, but it's not going to be you who's speaking. I'm going to speak through you. Why? Because I have a plan. And my plan is to tell the world the truth of the gospel. That while everything is crazy and everything's in chaos and there seems like there's no hope, there is hope, and it's founded in me. And one other thought he gives at the very end, he says, but those who persevere, those who endure will be saved. He's not saying you get saved if you make it. He's saying instead, it's an identification of the fact that you are one of his children. Because there will be plenty who will fall away. And time again in the New Testament, we see this take place. So what does this mean for us? Well, first of all, I just want to point to the veracity of Jesus' predictions here, right? He's telling us things that were to happen decades and decades later, and yet they all take place, and every one of them is exactly as they are. Today, it's relevant to us today, right? Because the end hasn't happened yet, and it's coming, and we can feel that, but who knows what that means? But the reality is these predictions are on point. He's God. He's God in the flesh. To make these kinds of predictions and for them to be true, that's crazy. You might as well, go get a lottery ticket, baby, if you think those odds are good, right? Because that's how high of a level of probability that all of this stuff is taking place, and yet it has. We can also be ready and be encouraged. Are we going to hide in our caves, or are we going to instead respond? And I want you to listen to the words of Peter, one of those disciples, as he's in a prison, because he's a follower of Jesus. Listen to his words and his encouragement. He says, now, this is 1 Peter chapter 3, starting in verse 13. Now, who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? He's just telling them to do good things and do good for their city. Who's going to harm you for that? But, he says, but even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, which, by the way, Jesus said would happen, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. And so he's giving them some encouragement, saying, listen, in the midst of you suffering some perhaps persecution or some kind of suffering in general because of you following Jesus. And for us today, it's going to look different than it did for them, right? But even Paul, a missionary, he kind of equates all of it. There's suffering that takes place at the hands of actual people where they're beating you or mocking you for your faith. But there's also things that are happening behind the scenes that cause some suffering. Cars breaking down, sicknesses, frustrations, temptations, on down the line. All of this is a part of this persecution that's taking place because you have, not only do you have the world maybe opposing this, but you have an indignant enemy who behind the scenes is so furious at what's taking place with the gospel, and he wants to do anything he can, again, to distract us from that mission of preaching the gospel here, there, and everywhere, and making disciples. He wants to do that for the church in any way possible. And when you follow Jesus, if you're following Jesus, and you will encounter suffering, you will encounter some sort of persecution on some level, and that's reality. And if you're following Jesus and that's not happening for you, let me just encourage you, listen, you're probably not following Jesus, right? The reality is it is connected, and are we going to hide? But what Peter says here is he says, hey, when you encounter those things, people are going to look at all the chaos going on. They're going to look at all the things that are maybe even happening to you personally, and they're going to see your hope-filled eyes as you put your hope and faith in Jesus, and they're going to want that because it doesn't make any sense. And they're going to ask you why you have hope even in the midst of those things. And that's what Peter's talking about. And I think we can do the same thing as we don't hide in our caves, but we seek to do good and we seek to give hope in the midst of all this. A couple thoughts as we conclude. We will all come face to face with Jesus someday. And that's not to scare you. That's just what's going to happen. All of this is transpiring to bring us to the point of judgment. Will you be prepared for that? Have you staked your hope in Jesus Christ, His life, His death, and His resurrection? And if you have questions about that, we want to talk with you about that as you kind of wrestle with that. Maybe that's something that right now you need to do, where you pray and you ask God, saying, I know I'm not able, but I'm praying, God, that you would rescue me from my sins and that I'm putting my faith and my trust in Jesus to be my Savior. And if that's something that you want to even do today, if you want to have a conversation, we can talk about it and we can show you, or perhaps it's something you want to do on your own. And let us know so that we can help you then start to follow Jesus in your everyday life as you're connected to the gospel that way. And then furthermore, not only are there those who we all come face to face with Jesus, and the reality is some of us coming face to face with Jesus, that every day are we going to take courage in the midst of all that's going on, right? Knowing that it's necessary, that God's at work, and that we can have hope that He's going to use us in His own special way to uniquely show people the gospel. And we can take heart in that. And if you're wrestling with that today, you have questions about those things, you want to get connected to others so you can do life together in that, reach out on your connection card in the appropriate ways and let us know how we can be a help and how we can pray for you. Right now I'm going to pray for you, and then I'm going to hand it over to Matt, and he's going to end us with some announcements. God, we thank you for your grace and mercy. And we lay at the foot of the cross our worries and our angst, knowing that even in the midst of all that's going on today, God, you have an answer for that, and it's your Son, Jesus. He is the answer. And God, I pray that we as Gospel Life Church and even as individuals, God, that we would be a bastion of light to our city and to our world of the hope that is found in Jesus Christ. And that hope that's found now as we get just a little taste of that, and the hope in the future where the real city is. And God, I pray for those who are here this morning who are wrestling with, how can they be connected to you, and they want to know more. And so God, I pray you give them the courage to reach out. You give them the courage to reach out to you as well as they seek to find out that they have a Savior in your Son, Jesus. I pray for us as Christians, God, we would stake our hopes to you in everyday life. Thank you so much for your word that is so relevant today. It's in your Son's name we're able to pray. Amen. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Matt. Matt, take us home.
Hey guys, I'm so glad that you're with us this morning. Thanks for joining us. We would love to connect with you. So whether you've been around GLC since the beginning or whether you're just a first-time guest with us this week, we'd love to hear from you and connect with you. So the way to do that is to fill out a digital Connect card online. So the link for that will be in our description, or it'll be also on the screen. So make sure to fill one of those out. If you're a first-time guest with us today and you fill out one of those Connect cards, what we're going to do is we're going to send you a $5 gift card, and then we're also going to donate on your behalf $5 to our benevolence fund. Also, after this is over, we have a kids church available for anyone who's in preschool all the way through elementary school. So if you have kids, we would love for you to click on the links of those and check out our kids church. It's something for them to minister and serve them well. So make sure to do that. Also, right now after this time, we have a time of worship. So make sure not to go anywhere, stick around, and let's worship God together.
God, I'm on my knees again. God, I'm begging, please again. I need you. Oh, I need you. Walking down these desert roads, water for my thirsty soul. I need you. Oh, I need you. Your forgiveness is like sweet, sweet honey on my lips. It's like the sound of a symphony to my ears. It's like holy water on my skin. Dead man walking, slave to me to the riverside. Take me under, baptize. I need you. Oh God, I need you. Your forgiveness is like sweet, sweet honey on my lips. It's like the sound of a symphony to my ears. It's like holy water on my skin. God, I need it every day. It's the only thing that ever really makes me want to change. I don't want to abuse your grace. God, I need it every day. It's the only thing that ever really makes me want to change. I don't want to abuse your grace. God, I need it every day. It's the only thing that ever really makes me want to change. I don't want to abuse your grace. God, I need it every day. It's the only thing that ever really makes me want to change. Your forgiveness is like sweet, sweet honey on my lips. It's like the sound of a symphony to my ears. It's like holy water on my skin.